If you are standing right in the central corridor of the main building at the University of Notre Dame, you kind of have this basic expectation.
Right, like an architectural expectation.
Exactly. When you walk into a grand 19th century administrative space like that, you look at a wall and you just expect it to be a wall. I mean, it's plaster, it's paint, maybe some brick. It's static.
Yeah, it holds the ceiling up. It's a physical boundary, nothing more.
Right. But in this specific corridor, that whole comforting concept of a simple wall is just completely shattered because you aren't just looking at plaster. You are staring directly at this, deeply contested, incredibly complex historical landscape.
It is basically the absolute definition of historical muddy waters. I mean, when you look at these specific walls, you're actually looking at overlapping layers of memory, conflicting cultural narratives, shifting American identities, and they are all fighting for the exact same square footage.
Yeah, the physical space itself has literally become an argument. Well, we are broadcasting today straight from the common room of the little station on Commercial Street in Atchison, Kansas, for Chesterton Radio. We've got a fire going in the hearth. We have this enormous stack of historical documents spread out on the table between us. And we're jumping into a really profound mystery today.
A mystery that touches on art, religion, cultural trauma, and really how we as a society just decide what we are going to remember.
Exactly. So the big question is, what exactly is hidden behind those beautiful nature-themed tapestries that are currently lining that central corridor of the main building? And, why did the university, after literally decades of agonizing debate, finally decide to cover these historic artworks up?
To figure that out, we're going to rely on a truly fascinating stack of sources. I mean, we have material straight from the Notre Dame archives. We're going to look closely at public letters from University President Reverend John Jenkins.
Yeah, those letters are incredible.
They really are. And we also have historical accounts, fierce debates from the university's alumni magazine, and perhaps most uniquely, we have transcripts from 2 vintage mid-century radio broadcasts.
Those are wild. They serve as these perfect little time capsules, right?
Exactly. Showing us exactly how the narrative around this specific historical figure has just violently shifted over time.
And the figure, of course, is Christopher Columbus. And the artwork in question is a series of 12 massive murals painted by this artist named Luigi Gregori.
Right.
So our mission in this deep dive is to trace how a single work of art, a work that is permanently chemically bonded to the plaster of a university wall, how it can mean drastically, almost unimaginably different things to different generations of human beings walking down the exact same hallway.
It's a huge journey.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have a massive road ahead of us. We have to travel from the ashes of this devastating fire in 1879 to the golden age of post-war radio, and finally into the really passionate modern debates about memory and tradition that are happening right now.
But to understand the paint on the walls, we actually can't start with the artist. We have to start with the fire.
Right. You have to rewind to April 23, 1879. So Notre Dame was founded in 1842 by a young French priest named Reverend Edward Sorin. And he was with his companions from the Congregation of Holy Cross.
And they literally started with almost nothing.
Literally nothing. Like $310 and a snow-covered tract of land in northern Indiana. And over 3 decades, just through sheer force of will, they built this thriving college. But on this specific spring day in 1879, everything changed in just a matter of hours.
Because of the architecture of the time, the structural mechanics of 19th century buildings made this just a total nightmare scenario.
Oh, absolutely. The archival accounts are terrifying. You have to picture everything was centralized. The main building wasn't just, administrative offices. It was the entire university.
Right. Dorms, dining halls, everything.
Exactly. Kitchens, study halls, classrooms. Every student, every priest, every lay teacher lived and worked in this one massive structure. And then these adolescent students, they called them minims back then, they suddenly saw flames curling out from the roof.
You've got massive amounts of dry timber, huge open draft spaces, and virtually no modern fire suppression. Once that roof caught, physics just completely took over.
Yeah, the alarm goes up, and it is absolute chaos. Yeah. Kids are running through the halls screaming. People are desperately throwing furniture and books out of the upper story windows, just hoping to save whatever they can.
Which didn't even work, did it?
No. It's completely futile. As the fire consumes the upper structure, the heavy cornices collapse outward, crashing directly onto all those piles of rescued belongings on the lawn, and just sets all of that on fire, too.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then the flames eat away the timber, holding up the dome. The statue of Our Lady on top eventually gives way and just crashes right down into the burning interior. In 3 short hours, the entire central nervous system of the college is utterly annihilated.
Just gone. Miraculously, no one dies, but they're left staring at a smoking crater. Father William Corbin was the president at the time, and you can really understand why he just fell into sheer despair.
Yeah, he essentially told his students to pack whatever they had left and just go home.
Right. He made a promise that they would rebuild and open on time for the fall, but, I mean, looking at the ruins, it must have sounded like just an empty platitude. The institution seemed completely finished.
But this is the exact moment where Father Sorin, the founder, re-enters the narrative in a way that feels almost scripted for a movie.
It really does, because Sorin was actually traveling when the fire broke out. He rushes back to Indiana, steps off the train, and finds his entire life's work reduced to smoldering ash.
And the whole community is just reeling, right? They're waiting to see how the patriarch is going to react. So Sorin signals for everyone to follow him into the church, which had actually survived. He stands on the altar steps. He's 65 years old at this point.
And he addresses them with this incredible speech.
Yeah, the accounts have passed this quote down for generations. He basically says, "I came here as a young man and dreamed of building a great university in honor of Our Lady. But I built it too small, and she had to burn it to the ground to make the point."
Which is such an intense way to frame it.
Right. He says, "So tomorrow, as soon as the bricks cool, we will rebuild it bigger and better than ever."
It is a staggering display of psychological resilience. He literally reframes a catastrophic loss as a divine mandate for expansion. And he didn't just give a good speech, he actually provided the physical labor.
Yeah. Later that exact same day, they watched this 65-year-old priest pushing a wheelbarrow full of still smoking bricks through the rubble. He personally initiated the clearing process.
And that detail is just the anchor of this whole story. It completely explains the mindset of the institution moving forward. They hired 300 laborers, worked 16-hour days straight through the summer heat, and laid, I think, $4.3 million.
Yeah, millions of bricks in a matter of months, just to rebuild the main building in time for classes that fall. And true to his word, when they got to the top, they built the dome taller, wider, and for the first time, they actually gilded it in gold.
Which brings us to the interior, because when you construct a massive new building that fast, you are left with vast expanses of blank, fresh plaster in the central corridors. And Father Sorin was not a man who liked blank spaces.
Definitely not.
He was an unabashedly proud patriarch who wanted the walls of his resurrected university to make a definitive statement. So enter Luigi Gregori.
Right, Luigi Gregori. He was an Italian artist, and he had actually previously served as an artist in the papal household of Pope Pius IX over at the Vatican. Sorin had recruited him a few years prior to do artwork for the basilica.
But after the 1879 fire, Gregori gets this massive new commission.
Yeah, in 1881, he's tasked with painting the main thoroughfare of the new administrative building. And he decides to paint 12 massive scenes from the life of Christopher Columbus, applying the paint directly onto the wet plaster wall.
Now, if we just pause here, this raises an incredibly important question for a modern listener. Why Columbus?
That is the question.
Right. I mean, it's a Catholic university in the American Midwest in the 1880s. Why not paint scenes from the Bible? Why not paint the lives of the saints? Why choose an Italian explorer from the 15th century to be the visual centerpiece?
I was really chewing on this question while going through the sources because on the surface, it feels totally random. But to understand the mechanism behind this choice, you have to really contextualize what it meant to be a Catholic living in America during the 1880s.
You have to understand the hostility of the environment.
Exactly. Notre Dame was a frontier school founded by French missionaries, but its student body and the local community were heavily made up of European immigrants, Irish, Italian, German, Polish, and the American public square at that time was actively toxically hostile to them.
That's right. We're talking about an era of intense, organized anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant nativism. And it's vital to understand why this prejudice existed. It wasn't just, a generic dislike of newcomers.
Right. There was a specific political logic to it.
Yes. The prevailing nativist argument was that Catholics were fundamentally incapable of being loyal, democratic Americans, because the suspicion was that a Catholic's ultimate allegiance was always to a foreign monarchical power, the Pope in Rome.
So the logic went that Catholics were this subversive element that threatened the entire fabric of the American Republic.
Exactly. It was a potent, dangerous political force. And just to illustrate how deeply embedded and violent this prejudice was in that region, we just have to look slightly forward in the timeline to the 1920s.
Yeah, the KKK resurgence.
Right. By the 20s, the Ku Klux Klan was experiencing a massive resurgence, and Indiana was arguably its strongest northern stronghold. And the Klan in the Midwest wasn't solely focused on anti-black racism. A massive pillar of their platform was anti-Catholic nativism.
It's terrifying. In 1924, the KKK organized a massive rally right in South Bend, Indiana, specifically designed to intimidate the local Catholic population and the university itself.
And the response from the university was incredibly physical. 500 Notre Dame students stormed downtown South Bend and engaged in literal street combat with the Klan.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they literally ripped the hoods and robes off the Klansmen, broke up their rally, and drove them completely out of town.
It's incredible history, and it perfectly illustrates the pressure cooker these immigrants were living in.
Yeah.
They were under constant threat. By the way, this era of hostility is also partly why the university leaned into the famous moniker, the Fighting Irish.
Right, it started as a slur.
Exactly. Before it was an official mascot, it was a derisive, anti-Catholic slur used by opposing teams who sometimes refused to even play them. They'd call them papists or dirty Irish. So the university just took the slur, owned it, and weaponized it into a badge of honor.
So let's take all of that context, the constant need to defend their loyalty, the physical threats, and carry it back to 1881 with Father Sorin and Luigi Gregori staring at those blank plaster walls. They are desperately looking for a way to assert their community's rightful place in the American story.
And who, in the late 19th century, was considered the absolute, undisputed, ultimate symbol of the American story? It was Christopher Columbus.
The 1880s and 90s saw this huge explosion of Columbus veneration leading up to the 400th anniversary of his voyage. The dominant Protestant American culture universally hailed him as the intrepid explorer, the first American, the hero.
But here is the absolute genius of the choice for Father Sorin. Columbus possessed two specific demographic traits that made him the perfect geopolitical shield. He was an immigrant, and he was a devout Italian Catholic.
This is the crux of the whole issue. By commissioning an Italian table artist to paint the specific Italian Catholic explorer on their walls, they were constructing a profound visual argument for their own citizenship.
Father John Jenkins, the recent president of the university, articulated this perfectly in his 2019 letter. He noted that the murals were intended as a didactic presentation responding directly to the cultural challenges of the time.
The message broadcast to the outside world was that Catholic immigrants could be fully patriotically American.
Columbus was the rhetorical bridge. The logic was basically undeniable. If your greatest national hero, the guy you credit with discovering your country, was a Catholic immigrant, then you simply cannot deny Catholic immigrants a place in this country.
It's a brilliant survival tactic.
I was trying to think of an analogy for this. It's almost like a marginalized group today trying to prove they belong by painting the Founding Fathers wearing their specific cultural garments. It was marginalized people grasping onto the only unimpeachable hero they could find who shared their despised traits and holding him up like a shield.
Like you say, we aren't American. The guy who started America was one of us. From the perspective of the 1880s Catholic immigrant, the Gregori murals were a complete triumph. They were an assertion of dignity.
A daily visual reassurance that they belonged. But, and this is where the historical landscape really starts to crack, if it was a symbol of inclusion for European immigrants, what did that exact same paint mean for the people who are already living on the land?
Right. Because the story of Columbus isn't just about crossing an ocean, it's the story of first contact. And for the indigenous populations of the Americas, that contact was an apocalyptic event.
Which brings us directly to the visual reality of the art itself, and how it is perceived from a Native American perspective today. We have to look closely at what Gregori actually put on those walls. How is Columbus depicted in these panels?
I was looking at a pamphlet the university released back in 1997 when they were trying to provide historical context, and the pamphlet itself points out that Gregori depicted Columbus hagiographically.
Let's pause and unpack that term for a second, because hagiography is a very specific mechanism. It doesn't just mean a nice painting. A hagiography is literally the biography of a saint.
Yes. In visual art, it uses a very specific formalized language. Think halos, ethereal lighting, upward gazes toward heaven, these dramatic postures of piety. It's an artistic technology designed to smooth over human flaws and present the subject as a pure divine instrument.
Exactly. Gregori literally took the techniques he used in the Vatican to paint saints and applied them to a 15th century maritime explorer. In the murals, Columbus is glowing. He's beneficent. He's portrayed as bringing the radiant light of faith to a dark world.
But when you look at the margins of the paintings, how are the indigenous people depicted?
From the perspective of modern historians and Native American communities, it is jarring and deeply offensive. The indigenous figures in the murals are painted wearing stereotypical, historically inaccurate attire.
And more importantly, their posture is entirely subservient.
Right. They are shown as uncivilized, childlike heathens just cowering in awe of the Europeans. They clearly need saving. They aren't treated as complex human beings with their own societies at all. They're just reduced to passive props.
Which completely systemically erases the historical reality of what actually happened. The arrival of Columbus did not bring a gentle light of civilization. It inaugurated the decimation of native cultures.
Mass exploitation, expropriation of land, novel diseases.
And we must be clear about the historical record regarding Columbus himself. This wasn't just a tragedy of accidental disease transmission. Recent historical studies document his active, personal role in systemic cruelty and enslavement.
Right. He literally hauled hundreds of Native Americans across the Atlantic to be sold as chattel in the Seville slave market in Spain.
Father Jenkins's letter addresses this head-on by quoting Pope John Paul II. During a 1987 meeting with Native peoples, the Pope stated unequivocally that the encounter was a harsh and painful reality. He talked about the cultural oppression, the injustices, the disruption of their traditional societies.
To fully understand the tension at Notre Dame, you really have to root this historical reality specifically in the geography of the university itself. Because Notre Dame was not built on empty land.
No, it sits directly on the ancestral homelands of the Pokagon band of Potawatomi.
The history is so deeply intertwined. When Father Sorin first arrived in the 1840s, there was already a priest there, Father Stephen Baden, who had been acting as a missionary to the Potawatomi. So the very soil the main building stands on holds the memory of the indigenous people who were displaced.
So you have this profound, irreconcilable clash of realities occupying the exact same space. The imagery that functioned as a vital tool of empowerment for besieged Catholics in 1882 functions today as a celebration of cultural catastrophe for Native American students and staff who have to walk down that hallway.
From their perspective, the murals don't just hide the dark side of the story, they actively glorify the initiator of their ancestors' destruction.
This clash is what generated decades of festering tension on campus. Student groups, particularly Native American student associations, periodically called for the murals to be removed for years.
The university tried a half measure in 1997, right? They printed that a contextual pamphlet we mentioned and placed it on a stand near the murals.
Hoping to nuance the space.
Yeah, but as Father Jenkins eventually conceded, a busy administrative hallway is not a museum. You cannot force a 19-year-old rushing to the registrar's office to stop and read a nuanced historical brochure. The sheer scale of the towering murals completely overwrites a tiny pamphlet.
What's really fascinating here is the physical mechanism the university eventually chose to resolve this visual dominance. If you walk down that corridor today, the 1880s murals are no longer visible. The space has been literally overlaid with a new narrative.
And I want to be really clear on the mechanics here, because they didn't just, throw painters' drop cloths over them. The coverings themselves are highly engineered, deeply symbolic pieces of art.
Yes. The university commissioned an artist named Eric Baden from Conrad Schmidt Studios. They are a firm internationally recognized for historic art conservation. And Baden designed a series of massive tapestries to cover the murals.
They are woven in these incredibly rich, earthy shades of green, brown, rust, and gold. And the imagery depicts the flora and fauna of the Midwestern landscape. Trees, leaves, flowers, birds.
And this isn't just generic nature art. The specific botanical elements were drawn directly from the university's Green Newland herbarium. So immediately the coverings root the hallway in the actual physical reality of the local Indiana landscape.
But the most crucial detail is in the borders, isn't it?
Exactly. The borders of these tapestries are woven with geometric motifs, specifically reflecting the artistic traditions of the Pokagon band of Potawatomi.
Let's just sit with the symbolism of that for a second. You have 1880s European hagiography, which attempted to visually overwrite the indigenous reality of the Americas, and now is being physically covered and visually overwritten by indigenous Midwestern botany and Potawatomi geometric art.
I was reading about how they actually made these coverings, and the metaphor is almost too perfect. They used a dye sublimation print process to transfer the imagery onto the fabric.
Oh, how does that work?
Well, instead of just printing ink on top of the fabric, the process uses heat to turn solid dye directly into a gas, which then permanently permeates the fibers of the material itself. It doesn't just sit on the surface, it becomes part of the structure.
That is an incredible metaphor for how historical memory actually works. It seeps in, it alters the fabric of the institution, and practically speaking, these tapestries are secured in custom wooden frames that allow them to be physically removed when the frescoes underneath need to be studied.
It's a stunning visual representation of shifting institutional power. But we have a missing link here in the timeline.
Right, how did we get here?
Exactly. How did the cultural narrative shift so violently from the unquestioned hero worship of 1882 to the highly contested reality of today? To understand that, we can't just skip from the 19th century to the 21st. We have to look at the bridge.
We have to look at how the 20th century processed Columbus. And this is where our source deck gets incredibly fun. To understand how mid-century Americans internalized the Columbus myth, we're going to dive into 2 vintage radio broadcast transcripts.
These are absolute gold mines for understanding the cultural psychology of post-war America. Let's start with the broadcast from the Mutual Network. It's a presentation by the Family Theater called First Voyage of Columbus.
To give some context, Family Theater was a massive media production company founded by Father Patrick Peyton, and he was a priest of the Congregation of Holy Cross, the exact same order that founded Notre Dame.
Their famous motto was, "The family that prays together stays together." They had immense cultural reach and regularly enlisted A-list Hollywood stars.
This specific broadcast was hosted by Donna Atwood, who was a massive figure skating star at the time, and it starred an actor named Jan Arvan as Christopher Columbus. When I read this transcript, what immediately struck me was the intense, almost aggressive way the script frames Columbus's internal motivations.
They completely strip away any economic or imperial ambition. They frame him exclusively as a spiritual visionary.
Yes. The central conflict of the script is entirely built around establishing his pure intent. Early in the play, Columbus is at a convent, speaking to a priest, Father Juan Perez de Mara. He explicitly states that his primary motive is the extension of Christianity to the Eastern world.
And the priest actually serves as the skeptical audience surrogate. He pushes back and asks, primary, not the spices, the silks and riches of the East.
And Columbus basically just waves off the idea of wealth entirely. He tells a story about surviving a pirate attack and a shipwreck by clinging to an oar, claiming that God spared his life for a specific purpose. And that purpose was definitively not so that he might grow fat merchandising Eastern trade goods.
The dialogue is fascinating because it acknowledges that explorers are usually driven by greed, but it specifically immunizes Columbus against that accusation. The priest warns Columbus that the Spanish court will never believe him.
Right. He says an Italian businessman working for profit might be trusted, but a missionary working for the glory of God, never. He literally tells Columbus his motives sound a little too good to be true.
Which is exactly what the writers are doing. They're making him too good to be true. They elevate him from a flawed historical actor into a pure, unblemished saint. Later in the script, when he gets an audience with Queen Isabella's advisors, they openly mock him for being impractical.
But Columbus defends his voyage, not with maps or trade projections. He tells the monarchs he is offering them an opportunity to gain the favor of God by bringing his word to the East.
And look at how the script handles the actual historical negotiations. In reality, Columbus negotiated fiercely for massive personal wealth and power, 10% of all riches, the title of Viceroy of all discovered lands.
But the radio play bends over backwards to frame this as an act of humility. The Queen's advisor assures her that Columbus's demands are just a token price. The advisor confidently concludes that Columbus is undertaking the voyage for God and country in a strictest sense for God alone.
This spiritual framing continues relentlessly once they are on the water. When the crew becomes terrified and mutinous, demanding to turn back, Columbus doesn't rely on his authority as captain. He doesn't threaten them, he preaches to them.
Yeah, he tells the terrified sailors they shouldn't fear the strange stars because they are on a holy mission. In the climax of the mutiny, he tells the armed sailors, "Put away your arms, replace them with your beads that you might give thanks to God."
It culminates with Columbus stepping onto the beach, planting the cross, and the narrator delivering the thesis statement of the entire broadcast. The only profits he ever gained from the discovery of America were spiritual.
It's just a flawless distillation of Columbus into a paragon of mid-century American religious confidence.
Yeah.
He is completely scrubbed of the messy, brutal realities of imperialism. Now, if we pivot to the second radio broadcast, we see a slightly different but equally powerful mid-century myth.
This is a transcript from CBS's legendary series You Are There, and the episode is titled Columbus Discovers America. I just love the mechanics of this show.
It's incredible audio theater. The listener who hasn't heard it, You Are There, took historical events and dramatized them as if modern, mid-century CBS News correspondents were physically on the scene.
Broadcasting live via shortwave radio, it applies the gritty, urgent cadence of World War II reporting to events from centuries ago.
The transcript opens with the CBS London anchor Dan Hollenbeck speaking in that clipped, urgent news voice. He announces that it's October 12, 1492, and they've lost radio contact with their correspondent, John Daly, who is embedded aboard the Santa Maria.
They treat the ships exactly the way Walter Cronkite would later treat the Apollo 11 moon landing. The anchor solemnly intones that the ships have either sighted land, turned back to Spain, or met an unknown fate in uncharted seas.
And to build tension, they cut to reporters interviewing people back on land. They interview his brother, who talks about his unshakable dream. They interview a sailor's wife in Spain who expresses her absolute terror of sea monsters and whirlpools.
It grounds the myth in this very rational journalistic reality, and when they finally establish a crackling radio link with John Daly on the ship, the psychological atmosphere they create is suffocating.
Daly reports from the middle of the Sargasso Sea. He describes the ships being trapped in a great meadow of weeds of green and yellow, and the detail he adds is terrifying. He says the weed isn't solid enough to walk on, but at night, you think you see these strange shapes moving about.
The crew genuinely believes the ocean itself is rotting beneath them. Then the wind dies completely. Daly reports from a dead calm. The water rations are running out.
And he explicitly reports on the mechanics of the mutiny. He tells the anchor, the men have only one thought now, to turn back. He says more of the crew are condemned murderers who obtained pardon from the king, desperate men with nothing to lose.
And how does he describe Columbus in the face of this mob? He says Columbus is stubbornly bent on a dream, possessing the fanaticism required to push forward.
This broadcast leans heavily into a very specific mid-century narrative, the exceptional, rational, steadfast leader overcoming the chaotic, superstitious masses. It's a story of American grit and scientific progress conquering fear.
So if we synthesize these two broadcasts, we can clearly map out what we might call the three eras of memory regarding Columbus in America.
Let's lay them out. Era 1 is the 1880s, the era of Father Sorin and Luigi Gregori. In this era, Columbus is the Catholic immigrant symbol of belonging. He's a defensive mechanism against nativism.
Era 2 is the mid-century, perfectly encapsulated by these radio plays. In this era, Columbus is the unshakable, heroic explorer bringing civilization and faith to the East. He is the ultimate paragon of American post-war confidence.
Completely divorced from any economic greed or imperial violence. And Era 3 is today. In our current era, Columbus is a highly contested, profoundly complicated, often condemned historical figure whose actions inaugurated centuries of trauma for indigenous peoples.
So if we take these three eras of memory and bring them all the way back to that physical hallway in the main building at Notre Dame, we can see the sheer impossibility of the situation.
It is an impossible knot. You have a modern university living firmly in Era 3, tasked with managing a massive piece of public art that is permanently plastered to its walls.
Art that was created with the passionate defensive motives of Era 1, utilizing the triumphant visual language of Era 2, and completely ignoring the moral realities understood in Era 3.
You literally cannot just peel the paint off the wall. The pigment is chemically bonded into the plaster. If you attempt to remove it, you destroy a 140-year-old piece of vital institutional history that tells the story of how Catholic immigrants fought for their place in America.
But if you leave it completely visible and unmediated, you are forcing every Native American student to walk past a celebratory depiction of their cultural apocalypse every single time they go to a meeting.
Which brings us to Father John Jenkins, the university president, and the excruciating no-win decision he had to make.
For years, the university deliberated. They didn't rush this. They formed committees. They held listening sessions with student groups, with angry alumni, with faculty historians, and crucially, with representatives of the Native American community.
Finally, in January 2019, Father Jenkins released a public letter announcing his decision. And reading his letter, you can feel him trying to thread a microscopic needle.
He beautifully laid out the complexities we've been discussing. He explicitly acknowledged why the murals were painted to encourage marginalized Catholic immigrants. But he also forcefully acknowledged the catastrophe Columbus brought to Native peoples.
His decision was a carefully engineered compromise. He announced that the murals would absolutely not be destroyed, nor would they be permanently painted over. Instead, they would be preserved safely behind the removable woven material we discussed earlier.
To ensure the art remained accessible for study, high-resolution digital images would be made available elsewhere, and a permanent, highly contextualized exhibit would be installed on the second floor.
Furthermore, the actual physical murals can still be uncovered for specific, limited instructional periods. For example, the university scheduled weeks where the tapestries would be removed, so instructors could bring their students to view the actual frescoes in person.
But because it requires erecting scaffolding to remove the heavy frames, it's a laborious process, strictly limited to intentional academic study.
The execution of this decision in the autumn of 2020 sparked intense reactions from all sides. To really grasp the depth of this cultural friction, we need to impartially examine the strongest arguments for both sides of this debate as they played out in the Alumni magazine.
Let's start with the strongest argument for covering the murals. Father Jenkins stated his core goal clearly. The university must avoid unintentionally marginalizing others while still respecting the immigrant Catholic heritage.
The fundamental argument here is about the purpose of a shared space and the university's primary duty to its current living community.
Exactly. We have to consider the specific real estate these murals occupy. The central thoroughfare of the administration building is not a neutral space. It is a space of supreme honor.
When a university displays massive, hagiographic portraits of a historical figure in that specific space, the environment makes a declarative statement. It tells everyone that the university officially celebrates this figure. And implicitly, it tells the descendants of his victims that their trauma does not matter.
I was reading through the Notre Dame magazine comments, and a commenter named Larry Didier synthesized this argument incredibly sharply. He was pushing back against alumni who were dismissing the decision as mere political correctness.
Didier suggested it should be termed morally correct. He pointed out the inescapable visual reality. The murals depict Native Americans as subservient heathens. He challenged the alumni, asking how they would feel if they were forced to navigate a space that glorified racism against their own ancestors.
From this perspective, the pro-covering argument is incredibly strong. It asserts that preserving the murals physically behind tapestries protects the artifact, honoring the 1880s Catholic immigrant who painted it. But it removes the daily psychological burden from the indigenous students of today.
Now, we have to look at the strongest argument for leaving them visible. And the best version of this argument isn't just a generic plea to preserve history. It is a profound philosophical argument about the fundamental purpose of a university.
Patrick Griffin, a professor of history at Notre Dame who actually served on the committee advising Father Jenkins, articulated this brilliantly. He argued against covering them, saying, "One of our jobs is to muddy the waters."
That phrase is so good. Muddy the waters.
He said we need to acknowledge the tangledness and complexity of our history. Some things that we now regard as evil were once regarded as good. Both interpretations are part of the history of Notre Dame.
The argument Griffin is making is that by covering the murals, the university is taking the easy way out. They are sanitizing their own messy history to avoid conflict. The discomfort the murals cause isn't a bug, it's the future.
A university is exactly the place where young adults should be forced to confront uncomfortable realities of how previous generations thought and how those values were often blind to the suffering of others.
You saw this echoed by several alumni in the comments. People argue that covering the art was a capitulation to a trend of political correctness, an attempt to create a smooth and placid environment.
Other commenters pointed out that, despite his massive flaws, Columbus did initiate the global interconnectedness of the modern world. They argued that erasing his image ignores the monumental physical courage his voyages required.
The underlying fear in this argument is about the sterile endpoint of this logic. If an institution covers up every single piece of historical art that offends modern sensibilities, they will eventually find themselves living in a completely sterile environment, devoid of any connection to the flawed human beings who built the place.
Which raises perhaps the central question of this entire deep dive. Does a university better serve history and its students by leaving difficult artwork visible and forcing a daily confrontation with the past? Or does it better serve its community by curating its ceremonial spaces to reflect its current moral values while preserving the artifacts safely behind closed doors?
It is a phenomenal, almost impossible question. And to help us navigate this deeply complex paradox, I want to invite a very specific thinker into our common room here at Chesterton Radio. Let's pull up a chair for the man himself, G.K. Chesterton.
Now, obviously, a quick caveat. Chesterton died in 1936. He never commented on the 2019 Columbus mural controversy. But his philosophical framework, the way he viewed history and tradition, is an incredibly useful lens.
Let's apply a distinctly Chestertonian perspective. Chesterton is famous for coining the concept of the democracy of the dead. He argued that tradition isn't just blind obedience to the past, it's an expansion of the voting franchise.
He wrote that tradition means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about.
This is a brilliant, provocative lens, because if we vigorously apply the democracy of the dead to the hallway at Notre Dame, it doesn't offer us a clean, easy answer. It actually cuts in both directions and dramatically deepens the paradox.
Let's look at how Chesterton might defend the murals being visible. Chesterton had a deep distrust of fashionable orthodoxies and what he saw as the simplistic snobbery of modern progress. He would likely be intensely skeptical of the modern impulse to just throw a tarp over old art because our refined sensibilities are offended.
He would almost certainly argue that Father Sorin, Luigi Gregori, and those 1880s Catholic immigrants who felt literally, physically besieged by Protestant nativism deserve a vote in this democracy. They didn't paint those walls out of malice. They painted them out of a desperate human need to belong.
Chesterton would warn against the arrogant oligarchy of the 21st century, marching in and silencing the genuine cries of the 19th century. He might argue that removing their visual voice is a form of disenfranchising the dead.
But on the other hand, Chesterton was not a blind defender of power. He delighted in overturning comfortable assumptions, and he fiercely championed the little guy. He spent his life defending the marginalized, the people whose voices powerful societies routinely ignored or crushed.
Absolutely. If tradition truly means giving a vote to the dead, then Chesterton would look at those murals and unequivocally demand that the silenced voices of the Pokagon Potawatomi ancestors be given a vote.
He would look at the historical record of Columbus and demand a vote for the people hauled back across the Atlantic in chains. Their history, their trauma, and their blood are also permanently tethered to the reality of those murals. The 1880s immigrants aren't the only dead people who deserve a voice.
So if we follow Chesterton's logic, we arrive at a genuinely profound question. And I want to pose this directly to you, the listener, sitting with us in the common room. Can we allow Father Sorin, the 19th century Catholic immigrants, the Native Americans, Father Jenkins, and today's students all to have a seat at the exact same table?
How do you hold a democracy where the voters possess completely irreconcilable, deeply painful truths?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the resolution the university arrived at offers a fascinating possibility. Perhaps the answer to an incomplete, biased history is not less history. It isn't destruction. Perhaps the answer is more history.
I think you're hitting the nail on the head. Let's think about the physical reality of the corridor today. When you walk through it, you see Eric Baden's Tapestries. You see the rich greens, the Potawatomi motifs, the Midwestern flora. That is the layer of the present.
But underneath those tapestries, physically touching the plaster, Gregori's hagiographic Columbus is still there.
Exactly. The tapestries are not an erasure. They are a new layer of paint on a very old, ongoing canvas. The university didn't scrape their uncomfortable past away. They added their present moral understanding on top of it. They created a physical, tactile record of their own institutional moral evolution.
It's a literal architectural layering of memory. Which brings us back to the generations of people who have walked through that main building over the last century and a half. Think about how the lens of history shifts depending on who is doing the looking. What would Father Sorin have seen when he looked at those walls in 1884?
He would have seen miraculous survival. He would have seen his university rising from the ashes of a devastating fire. He would have seen vindication and a defiant public declaration of his Catholic faith cemented permanently into the American bedrock.
And what might Father Theodore Hesburgh's generation have seen? Father Hesburgh led Notre Dame from the 50s through the 80s. This was the era of that booming post-war, mid-century confidence we heard in the radio plays.
That generation likely walked past the murals and saw unalloyed American exceptionalism. They saw deep institutional pride. They saw the triumphant, unquestioned march of Western civilization and scientific progress.
And what does a Notre Dame student see today?
Today's student sees the complexity. They see the cultural trauma. They see the heavy, tangled weight of history, and they see an institution grappling, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes painfully, with its own past and its own blind spots.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The most remarkable, mind-bending thing about the Columbus murals is that the physical paint on the plaster hasn't changed a single microscopic bit since Luigi Gregori put down his brush in 1884.
Right. The chemical composition of the pigments is identical. The lines are the same. The colors are the same.
The paintings haven't changed. We have changed. Our lens has shifted. Our understanding of the world, our historical empathy, and our definition of who gets to participate in the American narrative has radically expanded.
It forces you to look at every single piece of public art, every monument, every named building differently. We started this deep dive talking about a wall and how a wall is usually just a simple structural thing.
But we've seen today that a wall can be a theological argument, it can be a geopolitical shield against the Klan, it can be a weapon of erasure, and it can be a complex tapestry of completely conflicting memories.
And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over as you leave the common room today. We sit here in the 21st century, we look back at 1882, at Father Sorin and Luigi Gregori, and we can easily deconstruct their moral blind spots. We can see clearly what they missed, who they ignored, and the pain their art caused.
But if our understanding of history and morality is constantly evolving, if Chesterton's Democracy of the Dead is always expanding its voter rolls to include new voices, what monuments, what murals, what grand buildings are we constructing today, right now, with the absolute best, most righteous of intentions that might require their own tapestries in another 140 years?
What are our blind spots that the students of 2166 will have to cover up?
That is the truly humbling question. The past is complicated, but the future's judgment of us will be just as rigorous.
It really is. Thank you so much for pulling up a chair and joining us in the common room for this deep dive. It's been an incredible journey through fire, art, radio, and memory. Keep questioning the walls around you, keep expanding your democracy of the dead, and we'll see you next time.